If Theology Raw has blessed or challenged or encouraged you in any way, would you consider supporting the show through Patreon at patreon.com/Theology Raw? And we have ramped up our Patreon goodies. That's premium content available to those who support the show. There's too many to list here. Just go check it out at patreon.com/Theology Raw, or just click on the link in the show notes. My guest today, Elizabeth Neumann. Oh, my word. Elizabeth is a national security expert, violence prevention advocate, and author of the new book, Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. She served on the White House Homeland Security Council in the George W. Bush administration and as the Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism, hashtag Jack Bauer, at the Department of Homeland Security during the Trump administration. She is currently the Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot, a tech-enabled company supporting governments and community partners to understand and prevent violence. This was a wide-ranging conversation. We talked about the CIA. We talked about the deep state. We talked about Guantanamo Bay and some of the complexities with all those issues. And then we finally got into themes related to her book that talks about the rise of Christian extremism. This was a fascinating conversation. I really found Elizabeth to be wise, well-learned, experienced, and very fun to talk to. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Elizabeth Neumann. Elizabeth Neumann, I'm very excited about this conversation. How are you doing this morning?
I'm well, Preston. Thanks for having me.
So you have one of the most unique backgrounds of any of my guests that I've had on the podcast, and I've recorded over 1,200 episodes. So why don't we begin with, what line of work have you been in the last couple decades or so? Let's start there.
Yeah, I've been in the counterterrorism Homeland Security space for the last 2 decades. I started in college, worked on the George W. Bush campaign, and in doing that, when he won the presidency, I had the opportunity to move to DC and worked on domestic policy initially. The Faith-Based and Community Initiative, if anybody's old enough to remember the Compassionate Conservative agenda, that I worked on that. And then 9/11 happened and the priorities dramatically shifted, as they should. And it was kind of an all hands on deck thing. And Homeland Security was the new thing and nobody knew how to do it. So it created opportunity that perhaps somebody as young and inexperienced as I would not normally have the opportunity to do now. But I ended up working for the Homeland Security Advisor in the White House, and then later worked in a directorate that was called the Domestic Counterterrorism Directorate in the Homeland Security Council, which is now part of the National Security Council. And I got to work with some really incredible people like CIA operatives and FBI and Secret Service and Special Forces. And the function of those National Security Council offices is to bring in all of the operational expertise from all of the agencies that the federal government has. And then we work on the policy. And those guys, these guys are legit operators, like great war stories. And they hated writing. So I was like their scribe. I would work the policy piece of it. They would tell me what was broken and what we needed to fix. And then I would help them run the process. So I learned a lot from them and really became kind of to the extent that I'm a policy geek. I'm a policy geek for getting it right for the operators. That is my passion, is how do we make it work so that the people that are on the front lines keeping us safe can do that effectively, and they're empowered to keep us safe.
So you were not Jack Bauer, but you worked alongside Jack Bauer.
That's right. And,
for anybody who's familiar with the
24.
Show, 24.
Oh my gosh, I love that show. But yes, those early days, people would always be like, "Is it really like that?" And you're like,
"Yeah,
not at all."
I was gonna ask that, but I don't want to be too cheesy. But
no, there's some cool stories, but I can't tell you that.
You don't have to kill me.
But there are some really cool stories every once in a while. And I, early on in my career, this is really cool because it was new to me, and you kind of look underneath the hood and you're like, wow, we can do that. That's really impressive. And I left government well, I was a contractor for a while, and then my husband and I got married. We moved outside of Washington, D.C., and so I was raising kids, and I was just kind of out of the space, other than like very consultancy, private sector stuff, like how do you protect your power plant, that kind of stuff. I worked on that for a while, and I got recruited to come back into the Trump administration. I was recruited by somebody that I had worked with in the Bush administration. And I was like, no, I'm not interested. I don't want to uproot my family again. And, Trump's not my guy. He's not my type of Republican. And they asked me twice. I said no. The third time, it was right before the inauguration. And it was a much different call. It was this crew doesn't know what they're doing. It's very chaotic. We have some active threats that are of grave concern. And I don't know who will come in, and there's not many people I can trust. Will you consider coming in? And that just, look, I was there in DC on 9/11, and there's just this thing that pulls on me, having experienced that, to just want to do what I can, however the Lord is calling me, to keep our country safe. Well, my husband and I fought about it for a while, but then we decided to move and went into the Trump administration. And I will tell you, aside from the fact that it was very chaotic and some of the hardest times of service I've ever had, there were these bright spots where I was older, had higher title jobs. And so I would get to go on tours, and I would get to see some of the things that we can do. And oh my gosh, those moments where you're like, oh, we have some really smart people that do really good things that nobody's ever going to hear this story. But I'm so grateful for their service and how they keep us safe. I mean, it's the military, it's the intelligence community, it's the people that get slammed as the deep state. But they're not the deep state. Like these are just like, look, government is incompetent because it's made up of humans, and humans make mistakes. And sometimes, every once in a while, there are corrupt people in government, but there's no deep state that's out to get you. Like it really is a perversion, and kind of a slanderous evil to demean and belittle the public servants that are trying to do their best to make government work, whether that's making sure the Social Security checks go out or making sure that the missile doesn't hit our homeland. These are people whose names you'll never know, and they do it without the public recognition because they love their country and they want to take care of their families. So I really, as hard as those 3 years are, that's the bright spot, is getting to meet the men and women that are on the front lines of keeping us safe. And man, they can do some cool stuff. And it makes me proud that we can do that.
I would love to come back to the whole deep state conversation, but are you allowed to talk about some of the specifics or no? Like, is there, is there some things pieces that are just like, I cannot go into that at all? They would come after you or me.
I can tell you.
Can you give me some examples of what you're talking about?
Yeah. This one's kind of a funny one. I had the responsibility to review the cases of the individuals that were in Gitmo. So these are people that were affiliated with Al Qaeda that had been arrested and taken to Guantanamo Bay to stay at our military base there. And during the Obama administration, decisions were made to start a process for reviewing who could be returned to a third country and either rehabilitated or, perhaps, live in a situation where they're monitored in some way. Third countries don't have as many constitutional protections as we do. So some of this was about offloading, responsibility for caring for potential terrorists to partners and allies who might be better suited to deal with the challenge. It was also about recognizing that some of the individuals that we needed to charge, needed to prosecute, we were never going to be able to prosecute. And in fact, you actually see some of this still playing out today, where there are some of the bigger names that should be charged, and it is. I'm not a lawyer, but it is a completely thorny legal issue of how they will ever make it through a successful prosecution. So there's ongoing conversations with the families of the victims of 9/11 and the government about how to prosecute. But there's this whole category of people who were not directly involved in the 9/11 plot or attack, but were affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and they ended up in Guantanamo Bay. And we need to figure out how to, eventually move them out of our care, because that we didn't want to be locking them up in perpetuity. And there was a whole legal process that was done. The Department of Homeland Security had to review those cases, and every agency has a say, has either an approval, yes, this person can go to this third country, or no. And I was a part of that process. And in doing that, the military took us to Guantanamo Bay to show us how the how the facilities were set up and how we treated our prisoners, detainees. And I will tell you that I walked away from that experience really comforted in a strange way by when, as a country, we've gotten a lot of stuff wrong, and I'm not at all intending to whitewash that, but we do care for the human dignity, even of terrorists. And we look after their medical care. We look after their physical care, spiritual care, that, they have access to practice their beliefs, their religions. So in like much darkness, right? Like some of these individuals are, I believe, directly responsible for killing nearly 3,000 Americans. I don't have much pity for them. And yet, because we're the United States of America, we're going to still treat you like a human being. And we're going to offer you that dignity and respect, even though you did not give that to us. And the protections that are put in place to make sure that they are treated that way. It made me proud that's how we are trying to do that. Now, that does not take away the fact that we screwed a lot of stuff up right after 9/11, and we didn't offer that dignity and respect out of arguably fear. But like, one of the things that I think is really interesting about our country is we do have the capacity to learn from our mistakes and to change. And to incorporate, especially some of our institutions like the military, rigorous processes for incorporating those lessons learned and changing, and saying like, no, we can do better. We can do this, even hard things like having to deal with people that want to kill us. We can still do that in a way that is respectful of their human dignity. So that's just one example of some of the things that I had the privilege to see and just walk away from that going, there's a lot of reasons to beat up on the United States, our history, our current activities, but there's also a lot of good people that try to do the right thing. And I feel like those stories are often left untold.
What do you do with and here you're going to know way more about this than I did. I mean, with Guantanamo, I guess allegations, I don't know if it's been completely proven, of torture and just really abuse and everything. Like, is that part of the dark side that you're talking about? Or has that been proven, or I don't?
It has been disclosed. And one of the reasons that the prosecution of guys like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed are so difficult is because that evidence would get introduced in court and then make some of his admissions inadmissible. Like, there's like I said, I'm not a lawyer, but as I understand it, part of the reason we're in this kind of no man's land at this point with some of these prosecutions is because of the mistakes that were made in the immediate aftermath. And there was a whole bunch of pseudo psychology around, oh, this works. And, it got debunked pretty quickly, but they didn't act on it. Like there's a part of, I was so young at the time that I actually, I don't know, maybe 15 years later kind of went back and started reading some of the journalistic stories that were coming out. There have been some documentaries that come out, and I in going through that, um, have had like the adult recognition that, like, oh gosh, like I can both empathize that the driver there was fear and this desire to just make sure that America was safe no matter what. But in living and out of that fear, they ignored some of the evidence. Like there was pretty early on evidence that waterboarding doesn't work. Torture doesn't work. It doesn't actually result in good information.
No, it doesn't. So it's not, because there's the moral, the ethical question, but there's also the pragmatic.
Yeah. And that's,
but you're saying even pragmatically, if it doesn't even work.
Exactly. And pragmatically, like then you're kind of like, well, why did you still do it? And maybe there were some sadistic people who just wanted to met out revenge. But I think honestly, it just is more of like a product of, we were really scared. And I when I talk to younger people, and they're in the workplace, like they were born after 9/11, they don't know what that felt like. And so that it's not to give people an excuse, but it's to learn. When we get really scared, we are willing to compromise our values. We ignore evidence. We just kind of, it kind of goes back to some of Jonathan Haidt's research about our moral reasoning is actually much more emotional than it's like, and then we let the reasoning come afterwards. Like it's important for us to know that, especially as leaders, when you're making decisions in a time of volatility and emotions are high, that if we're not really careful, the fear drives us, even if you've made some other rational argument for why, like, no, I'm not being driven by my fear. I'm actually, this is the right thing. And I think that's like one of those lessons that I take from that time period, is how easy it is to compromise values when you're scared.
So I'm hearing you say, if I could summarize it, let me know if this is accurate. Like you take something like Guantanamo, and some of the torture stuff comes out, and the people have in their mind, like, this is just one big torture chamber. I'm hearing you say that those are the exceptions to the norm. The norm was actually pretty humanizing of these people who have done very evil things. But there were a dark side, but that is sort of the exception to the rule. Would that be inaccurate?
Yes, I think that's right. None of the torture, by the way, happened at Guantanamo Bay itself.
Oh.
Like it was all black sites, and Guantanamo Bay was the place where we brought people to house them as prisoners. So and there's a legal reason for that. It has to do with if you're on U.S. soil, you have constitutional rights, or you have lawyers who will try to say that you have constitutional rights. And Guantanamo Bay as a U.S. base is considered U.S. territory, although not nearly as strongly as, say, if you were brought to Florida, which was another argument that was happening during our tenure. Is like they wanted to close down Guantanamo Bay, and the only options were going to be to move people to U.S. prisons. And the American public didn't love the idea of Al Qaeda terrorists hanging out in some of their prisons in Kansas. So like there's all these sorts of interesting, challenging things the reality is we've made a ton of mistakes. We've also expressed remarkable restraint and remarkable, by and large, remarkable attempts to try to do things the right way. There are so many examples of individuals or maybe certain leaders in the military who don't abide by that, and the reason they end up in our headlines is because it is outside of the norm. And I think one of the things that's hard about the moment that we live in, where our feeds are constantly telling us all the bad stuff,
totally.
and is that we hyper focus on all of the bad, as opposed to that's an anomaly. It is an anomaly that should be treated seriously. It needs to be addressed. Justice is needed to be handled, but that is not a representation of how the United States operates, or the men and women who are in the intelligence community or in the military or in public service. Those are anomalies, and that's when we get into the deep state argument, that's I think where I get really upset. I feel like it's slanderous to besmirch the character of. You're talking about millions of Americans that serve in some form of capacity in local, state, or federal government. Millions. And you're just kind of broad brushing, saying they're the deep state and they're out to get you. And you're like, no, these are the people that allow your Amazon package to get delivered the next morning. These are the people that make sure that your roads are getting paved, or that the airport works the way you expect it to work. These are the people that make sure that the bad guys overseas stay overseas and don't show up in our country and blow up bombs like they do in other parts of the world. These are people that are day in, day out doing things that make you free to be able to spend your time the way you want to spend your time, for you to be able to not worry about where am I going to get food or groceries because it's available down at the store, because we have this amazing global system to be able to deliver fresh food to the neighborhood store down your street. I think we forget that the world we live in today is mind-blowingly different than what my grandmother grew up with, right? She was born in the 1920s. And we were just explaining to our daughter, imagine what it was like for her when she was your age. This is what she did every day. This is how they, had to prepare for winter, because there was no fresh fruit that she could just pick up at the store in mid-Missouri in December, right? You're just kind of going through, and she's, you just watch her eyes explode. But I think we all collectively have forgotten this luxurious life that we live doesn't exist, but for some, infrastructure and protection. And yes, there's so much brokenness in our system, but also, huge blessing that we take advantage of every day.
I got it. So a couple questions about the deep state. And this, first of all, this is super, super helpful. And I think two things I just want to absolutely affirm is that in our news cycle or post-internet world, we are often fed all the bad things in any situation and think that that's characteristic of the whole. I mean, we see this now with so many church leaders that are abusive and narcissistic and having affairs, and we hear all the stories of all the famous people, even though that might, and I'm not citing data here, but just kind of what if that represents 1 to 5% of all church leaders? The 95% that are pastoring churches of 120 people in Kansas, not whatever, that have prayed for the congregation, hours and hours a week, and are faithful to the wife, have been loving husbands and mothers and fathers and wife, those don't make the news cycle. We only hear about the few bad apples. And so it sounds like you're saying that's with the branch of government involvement you've had, that oftentimes all these negatives are what's front and center, and yet that represents maybe a small portion. Would that be an accurate way to describe what you get? Yeah. And that, sure. So that is and Patrick and I have talked about this a lot. I don't know, you might have talked about Patrick Miller on his podcast, but he's facing that as a pastor, church leader, that now there's a profound just distrust for anybody, any institution, anybody in authority. And he's overly talking about or focusing on the negative reports has caused a backlash on the people doing good work. And doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about the negative. And this is the kind of quandary we're in. You don't want to cover up all the abuse that people are engaged in, but then what do you do with the impact that has on all the people that aren't doing that? Anyway, that's my I really appreciate that. What is so like? So you've been knee deep in this. So this is. I hope I just I read books. I read other people. I listen to stuff. You've been in it. Um, but is it like when I think of something like the CIA? Assuming there are many, many really good people in that, we also do have a history of like regime changes. I mean,
Hmm.
coups that the CIA has been involved in foreign countries. I mean, I think of like 1953, where we overthrew the democratically elected leader and installed a brutal Shah that oppressed his people for decades, which led to the revolution in '79, and and then all this kind of animosity that some people in the Middle East might have towards America. It's like, well, is that just intrinsic anti-Americanism, or is it
Hmm.
blowback from kind of stuff we've been doing over
Hmm.
there? Like
Yeah.
is it blowback? And not that that justifies the blowback, but it's like sometimes I wonder, is our foreign policy, CIA involvement, democracy for me, but not for thee, like
Right.
what we've done in Guatemala and Argentina and so many countries has just, it seems like it's been brutal. So even if, and again, I'm just going on stuff I read, so I don't know if you have any hands-on thoughts, like what, maybe it's more complicated than that. Like, um, could so could there be something more systemic that's
Yeah.
problematic, even though there's lots of really good people that are doing good things within that problematic system, if that's the right way of putting it?
I
Yeah.
will say, I mean, I'm a conservative by philosophy, maybe is the way to frame it.
Okay.
I I do think where this is true of US government officials, I think this is true of our country in general. We
Mm.
underestimate sin, and we
Mm.
underestimate um, cultural differences. We tend to think that everybody operates by a Western individualistic
Right.
cultural mindset. Even when we talk about things like today, like Iran or Israel, and like you'll hear people say, "Well, oh,
Mm.
they'll never do this or they'll never do that," and you're like, "Oh, you're underestimating the religious drivers there." And
Yeah.
because you probably came out of a culture where maybe you were exposed to religion, but it just wasn't that deep for you.
Mm.
You can't examine if in foreign policy and in national security, like you have to know yourself and know your opponent, right? That's like one of the first steps, and is like, what are their drivers and motivations? We, the United States, have a lot of pride in thinking that we've got it all figured out and
Right.
that everybody thinks the way we do. So I've watched that both in my 20 plus years of work in the national security space, but certainly when you go back through history, you're like, yep, that was the wrong call, because
Mm.
you thought that a culture um, that is very communal, or has a very different value
Mm.
system than we do, would respond the same way that we did. And I don't necessarily think that I've never studied in depth some of those examples that you raised. So it's this. I'm not suggesting, though it could be, that the people that planned those things and executed them were nefarious in their intent.
Yeah.
Usually, what you see is more of a naivete, right? Like I'm trying to help because I want people to have freedom, but you naively think that
Mhm.
doing this one thing is going to fix it all,
Well,
and
and
you.
to be fair too, like a lot of these regime changes, I think there was 72,
Is that
74.
right? That's
Well, between in the Cold War era, between
yes.
40,
Yeah.
40, I think 48 to 99. And yeah, then this is not, it's well documented now. But you think about, okay, Cold War, so most of these regime changes were because another government was getting chummy with the Soviet Union. They
Yep.
were going communist. And again, looking back now, I think there was lots of mistakes done. But if I put myself in that world, it's like everything's seen as good, evil,
Right.
capitalism, communism. And so if you have that mindset, then when, Guatemala democratically elects a leader that maybe is more sympathetic with the Soviet Union, then it's like, well, those are the bad guys and
Yeah.
they're after us and they think we're after them, so again, I'm not justified at all. Looking back, I think few people can justify it, but if you put yourself back in that era of the Cold War, you can see at least the rationality maybe of the intent, what you're saying,
Yeah.
like that we're not just horrible people wanting to harm good people. It's like, well, no, we're from our perspective, we are fighting against this powerful evil that, if it doesn't go unchecked, is going to take over the world. And maybe there's some legitimacy to that. I guess I'm more concerned with some of the post Cold War regime changes that
Yeah.
we've been involved in Ukraine and several others. But uh anyway, we don't need to linger on that. I have a lot more questions. I'm
This
curious.
has gone in a different direction than I think we expected, but
we haven't even got into the main point of the book that we're going to talk about. So I do have one more political question I have to ask, and I just for our audience, we are recording this on October 29th, pre-election. My audience is listening post-election. So as we talk about politics, we don't know who's going to be in the office, who is in the office at the time of my audience listening. Anyway, what was it like working under the Trump administration? Did you hang out with Donald, or I just have to ask, what was that like being in that environment?
I mean, I was in the room with him a few times. I was always the staffer, right? So I was the deputy chief of staff to John Kelly. He was the Secretary of Homeland Security first before he became the chief of staff at the White House. And so being his deputy chief of staff meant that I was responsible for running all of the teams that support the office of the secretary, including, prepping the secretary before he goes to brief the president. So was often in the room when the secretary is talking to the president, or and occasionally in the room when he's briefing the president. So it's, that was 2017. So it was like the first year that he was secretary and I was in that role. And I know General Kelly would say he was naive, didn't understand who Donald Trump was. I knew who he was, but I also was naive in that I thought, you know what, he'll get into the office, he'll realize how serious this role is, and he'll rise to the occasion.
He'll stop tweeting.
Right. Or that he'll just let, like, the stuff that he doesn't care about, he'll just let the adults in the room, steer him in the right direction. And it operated that way in the first, year or so. But we had to learn how to staff this president. And that's true for every presidential administration. The differences here were the learning curve was not like, oh, this president prefers written briefs over PowerPoints, or 4 pages versus 20 pages. Like, some presidents love to read, some presidents just want to talk through things. Like, every administration has to figure out how they want to be supported. This was a little different. This was, you learned that if he had too big of a room for a briefing, he would move into entertainer mode. And so he wouldn't actually discuss the issue. He would, it was like he was performing for an audience. So we learned you have to keep the room really, really small if you need a decision from him. We learned you have to avoid certain trigger words. And the trigger words were things like Russia or domestic terrorism. It was anything that he had felt particularly attacked by. Like, so early on, there were the conversations around Russia collusion, and he gets defensive. So even if you're briefing, like, Russia shot a missile and it violates this treaty, and sir, we're going to get more information for you. Like, we would be off on, I won the election, Russia didn't get involved. And you'd just be like, okay, so let's figure out how to have this conversation without mentioning the word Russia. It was very much like you're managing, and I don't mean this demeaningly, I'm just drawing a parallel as a parent. You're managing a toddler or a teenager, right? Like, you're having to think strategically about how I'm going to address this issue that is likely to cause a tantrum. But he's the leader of the free world, and constitutionally, he's supposed to make this decision. So I need to figure out how to get him the information so he can make a wise decision. Usually when you brief presidents, you would give them options, and those options would be weighed in by the agencies. So you would have the Department of Defense wanting option A, and as a backup, we can live with B, but absolutely we can't do a C. And then everybody weighs in, and you get briefed on, here are your options, and here's what the support is from the different secretaries. And then you might, in the meeting, you'd be asking them questions. Well, why state do you want to do it this way? And let me hear you guys argue this out. That was my experience with George W. Bush. That's my observation as a contractor with the Obama administration. In Trump, what we found is if you gave him three options, he would usually just gravitate towards the worst option. Usually when you get, I mean,
like naively, or just
just like so psychologically, when you somebody's like trying to sell you on the one that like everybody's in agreement with, they create two options that are like clearly not good options. So then you're like, oh, well, this really is the good option. So that was kind of the MO for the community, is like, oh, well, nobody would choose that option because that's really bad. We've explained to you, here are all the negatives why you don't want to do this. And he would choose that option. We're like, oh, shoot. Okay, well, we can't put any bad option down. Like we can only list things that we can live with. And we also, one of the things I'd never seen the interagency do before, and I sorry, that's kind of an inside baseball term, but it's the term we use for all of the agencies that make up the national security community. And they all have equities, and they have authorities, and they have perspectives that they fight for. And usually there's a lot of consternation between those agencies. State and DOD are going to disagree on the level of force that should be used. And you work it through a policy process. As an assistant secretary, I was responsible for leading one of those policy processes. And then if we couldn't reach agreement, it goes to the deputy secretaries, then it goes to the secretaries. And then finally, a decision, if it either is legally required by the president or we can't get an agreement at the agency's level, it goes to the president for decision. What I saw in the Trump administration is, instead of that process working, it was, we need to reduce the number of decisions he has to make. So we've got to come to agreement on our own. So my level would work through, come up with the options, come up with the places where there's disagreement, and then would kind of just go directly to the secretaries, and the secretaries would get on the phone and they would reach an agreement so that we could avoid having to take things to the Oval Office. Now, I'm not saying that we did any of that in violation of the constitutional role that the president has to make decisions. I'm just saying that for those things where there's discretion, the default was avoid going to the president, because it just was not, you didn't know where it was going to end up. Yeah. So, I mean, it was a very unhealthy, chaotic environment. And you saw this in the public's eye, where he would send out a tweet and all of a sudden now we are withdrawing from Syria. And there had been no discussions, no national security planning for something pretty consequential that most Americans probably aren't tracking, but had significant homeland security implications, because by withdrawing from Syria, we have a whole lot of ISIS soldiers that are being detained by our allies, the Syrian Defense Forces. And when we withdraw, the Syrian Defense Forces were not going to be able to hold those prisoners. Those prisoners were going to go free. Those prisoners had desires to kill Americans and to get to the U.S. homeland to do so. And by withdrawing, we were opening the prison gates and saying, hey, have at it. Try to come kill us. I mean, there were like such monumental, on a whim. He talks to often it was like Lou Dobbs or like some Fox News host, and decisions that had been made that morning would be reversed by the afternoon because Lou Dobbs told him he didn't like the decision. So like utter chaos, no uniform way of like getting him to make a decision and stick with the decision. And then a whole system trying to adapt to that and figuring out how do we try to keep the guardrails up while in the midst of this chaos.
So it's fascinating and disturbing and interesting. Which it's so funny about the Russia thing to trigger, you know, avoid trigger words. In my limited anecdotal experience listening to Donald Trump, and I try to listen to more long form conversations, not the sound bites online. So like I listened to the whole recent Joe Rogan 3 hour conversation with him,
Oh, did you?
and he's been on other podcasts that I've listened to, and try to get the full, like I just want to like I want to, like, who is this, you know, who is this guy? um and it's a mixed bag, you know. I think some of the accusations from his opponents are seem pretty accurate, and other times I'm like, yeah, I think you're maybe spinning thing in the worst possible direction, whatever. But the one thing that seems really clear, and it's exactly what you're saying, is that Donald Trump's world is centered on Donald Trump.
Yes.
Like anything he's thinking about, it's he's just completely, and I would say narcissistically, just focused on
That's right.
him. You
That's right.
know, a topic will come up and he'll tell a story about him, and it's like, or that he'll hear a word about Russia, it's not even about him, and he'll turn it in on himself. Like, I mean, it's classic narcissism. I mean, I don't even think that's debated whether he is a narcissist. I mean, again, doesn't mean other options are better or worse. Doesn't mean there's not other good or bad or whatever. But like, I think that's pretty clear. That's interesting. My health is super important to me, which is why I've tried many different supplements. Now, there's lots of good products out there, but I've personally found AG1 to be the best nutrition supplement that I have ever taken. AG1 is a daily health drink that's packed with nutrients to help alleviate bloating, support sustained energy, and whole body health. It has crucial probiotics, prebiotics, adaptogens, vitamins, and minerals, all of which help combat stress, supports your gut health and digestion, and supports your immune system. Now, I've been taking it consistently now for almost 2 years, and it has been a game changer. I literally feel the difference. Not only do I experience steady energy throughout the day, I don't have an afternoon crash like most people who rely on caffeine alone to get them through the day. I personally, I typically take it first thing in the morning or early afternoon. And when I travel and I'm consuming way too many wings, pizzas, and tacos, I typically take AG1 twice a day. Now, right now, AG1 is running a special Black Friday offer for all of November. So this holiday season, try AG1 for yourself or even gift it to someone special. It's the perfect time to focus on supporting your body with an easy and surprisingly delicious daily health drink. And that's why I've been partnering with AG1 for so long. I really love this product. Every week of November, AG1 will be running a special Black Friday offer for a free gift with your first subscription, in addition to the welcome kit that includes a year supply of vitamin D3K2. So make sure you check out drinkag1.com/TITR to see what gift you can get this week. That's drinkag1.com/TITR to start your holiday season on a healthier note while supplies last. The Exiles in Babylon Conference is happening again April 3rd to April 5th, 2025 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I cannot wait for this conference. We're talking about the gospel and race after George Floyd. We're talking about transgender people in the church, social justice in the gospel, two perspectives, and a dialogical debate about whether the evangelical church is good for this country, featuring my new friend Adam Davidson. He's an atheist journalist, and Sean McDowell, my other good friend. They're going to banter around about that topic. We also have Latasha Morrison, Ephraim Smith, Mark Yarhouse, Malcolm Foley, and many other awesome speakers. We're also adding some breakouts this year, and we're going to have a killer after party. And well, can't wait for that one, actually. If you want to attend a conference, you can do so by going to theologyraw.com. You want to register early. We do have an early bird, a fairly aggressive early bird special. It ends December 31st. So if you are planning on attending the conference, you want to sign up before then. You can also attend virtually if you can't make it out to Minneapolis. Again, April 3rd to 5th, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Exiles of Babylon. Go to theologyandtheraw.com, and I hope to see you there. Well, you know, I have more questions, but for the sake of where are we? Almost 40 minutes in. I want to talk about your book. You wrote a. I mean, the title alone is pretty provocative. Kingdom of Rage: The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. In the summary, if I could summarize it, I'd love to kind of just throw it to you. in your work of being very concerned about radicals overseas out there, you began to see that there's a lot of radicalization within our own country that is almost a greater threat, and it's coming from self-professed evangelical Christians. Is that a accurate uh, summary so far? And would love to
Yeah.
have you
Maybe
expand on
just a
that.
slight nuance, which
Yeah.
is I would say that it is coming from the community in which Christians are engaging. So it's not all
Okay.
Christians.
Okay.
It's that we are associating with or adjacent to movements that are, in some cases, very clearly defined as violent extremists, and in
Okay.
other cases that are giving aid and support to violent extremists. And in so doing, we're opening ourselves up to being recruited in ourselves, sometimes unwittingly. That's the driver behind the book is um, to sound the alarm that we have a problem and we need to get wise on that problem so that we can push back against it. Because I do think not only can we reduce the amount of violence we're seeing in this country, I think the church has the answers in Jesus to the underlying drivers that lead to that violence. And so
Yeah.
I'm trying to apply my professional lens of what we now know about why somebody joins an extremist movement, why somebody commits a mass attack. It's not the ideology. That's like,
Hmm.
you want the cheat sheet for my book? It's not the
Yeah.
ideology. It is underlying psychosocial drivers, and those. It's complex. No, one person's journey to radicalization or to mobilization to violence is going to be the same, but largely speaking, they generally fall into one of two drivers: a need for belonging or a need for significance, or both. And it's usually
Ah.
activated by some sort of life crisis, humiliation. It can be a group humiliation. And I do think that might be what has happened to our community, where we feel attacked and we feel humiliated. We used to be the
Hmm.
majority, kind of norm. What it meant to be an American is you went to church on Sunday and you were a good person, and you adhered to certain Christian values. And I want to be clear, that doesn't make you a Christian, but our culture was largely Christianized. And our
Right.
culture is no longer a Christian culture. And so I think for a lot of people, that change has happened very rapidly. That creates a lot of uncertainty. And in that uncertainty and in that rapid change, people become vulnerable and very open to messages of the way that extremists operate, which is very black and white thinking,
Hmm.
very solutions oriented. I'm going to take things back by force. I'm going to protect you. And when you're feeling that great uncertainty, having somebody come alongside say, I can fix this for you, that feels really reassuring. And so it's really what I'm trying to sound the alarm is we already have a pretty significant problem in the country of violence being on the increase since 2015. And I think a lot of that is coming from individuals that the data says that it is coming from individuals primarily on the right. They're politically speaking.
Hmm.
There are left-wing violent extremists, and I discuss that in the book too. They tend to not be as lethal. They tend to not be as premeditated in their plans for violence. That doesn't mean that they're not criminals, that they don't need
No.
to be addressed, but the mass attacks, the number of deaths, the plots, exponentially higher from those on the right. And we need to see that. And we need to stand up against it because we
Yeah.
are supposed to be a people of peace. And even just playing footsie with them is not
Hmm.
okay as followers of Christ.
Can you give us like specific examples? What kind of violent type groups are you thinking of?
Yeah. So the two categories that are the most responsible for deaths and plots are white supremacist extremists and militia violent extremists or anti-government extremists. Those categories, I will tell you, social scientists like things in clean boxed categories. And in reality, what you have is like, if you're a white supremacist, you're probably also an anti-government extremist. If you're an anti-government extremist, there's probably a tinge of some sort of racial superiority. Maybe you're not a pure white supremacist. Maybe you don't want your own white nation. That's kind of what a traditional white supremacist wants. But you're also looking for a return to when you had your power, more power than perhaps you feel like you do now. So there tends to be a lot of overlap between those categories. Groups are things like neo-Nazis. The Proud Boys are designated in Canada as a terrorist organization. In the U.S., we do not designate terrorist organizations, but some Proud Boys members have been convicted of being involved in what we would consider terrorist attacks or terrorist plots. We have 3%ers, that's a militia group. Oath Keepers, they became quite famous after January 6th. But there's lots of different names for these groups. Some of them are much more violent than others. Most tend to not be overwhelmingly violent. It's more, they like to espouse and create the milieu where a lone offender usually goes off and does something.
And are you saying that these groups are growing in popularity and in number? Is that kind of a sub-premise of your book?
They certainly were beginning in 2009. We started to see an increase in people growing. There's been like kind of two or three waves of organized extremist movements. The first big wave in the modern era was after the Vietnam War. And we saw pretty big spikes in the 80s, late 70s and 80s into the 90s, right? Everybody remembers the Oklahoma City bombing.
Yeah.
That is a part of that wave. The bombing at the Olympics in Atlanta, another example of that. And then when 9/11 happened, and it's not abnormal when you have an external enemy for your domestic groups to kind of go quiet, right? Because you have something external to be focused on. So
it has a unifying factor.
It does. It went a little quiet. I mean, they were still there. They still had their opinions, but they weren't as active. And then the two key drivers behind the current movement, 2008 financial crisis, we usually see spikes in domestic. This is, by the way, worldwide. This is not unique to the United States. You tend to see spikes in domestic terrorism after financial crisis and after war. So we've had both of those in the last 20 years. And so it wasn't surprising that beginning around 2009, 2010, we started seeing growth in militia, growth in people joining white supremacist groups. And then you add to it social media, which really comes into its own in the 2010s. And the movement's changed. It used to be very much hierarchical. There was organization. There were groups that you actually went to go and meet with. Now it's almost predominantly online, except for some militia groups still get together in person. Some white supremacist groups live together on compounds. But most of the way that we're seeing growth is through people connecting online, not actually physically going in person.
I heard, I can't verify this, but I heard that my home state of Idaho has the most number of radical militia groups per capita than any other state. Is that true?
Yes.
Did you do some research here in Idaho in the hills? Or?
I've always wanted to come to Idaho, but no, you guys have quite a rich history up there. Yeah. Do you ever run across them?
Here's the thing. I've never, but Idaho, the geography is really interesting. I mean, you have the southern third where almost all the population lives, especially where I live in Boise. It's just, it's actually more of a blue town. Boise, the greater, they call it the Treasure Valley is, probably like a third of the population of Idaho lives here. So it's all in the north, in the mountains closer to like Coeur d'Alene. I've never even been up there. So yeah, unless you're like driving through deep mountain, roads that you wouldn't normally go on, you're not going to stumble upon some compound. But I've heard they're there, but no, I've never seen, anything like that. But we do love our guns. I mean, our gun culture is for people that live in like a blue state, or if they grew up in like New York City or something, like it's not, we have last time I checked, you don't need any kind of permit to open carry. So
Mm,
you can have 18-year-old kids walking around holstered up, a couple of guns in their hips. You might, it's not abnormal to see it at church, people
yeah.
bringing guns and stuff. I mean, it's yeah, it's I grew up around guns, and I'm, it's not that shocking to me to, well, not as I reflect on it, I'm like, that's the scariest thing I've ever seen. I'm way more scared of an 18-year-old white dude with a couple of guns than I am of some potential like Middle Eastern terrorist in
Right?
Idaho or something, because this kid's gonna see some brown person walk in with a squirt gun, and how do I know he's not gonna get all Rambo on him, or and I
Yeah.
don't, it's luckily we have not had hardly any instances of, you know, stuff breaking out here that, is I mean, every now and then, but yeah, anyway, it's oh, so going back, like, does this, I'm curious, does this almost make sense of, not justify, but it makes sense of the rise of, we'll call it Trumpism,
Mm,
that you have a
mhm,
population that once had power, now they feel like that power has been taken away culturally,
mhm.
even like educationally. Most university campuses are pretty
Yeah.
left. Um if you wear a MAGA hat, you're going to get harassed. Like, it's there's lots of parts of our culture that doesn't like conservatives. So now you have this group that feels oppressed, and you have Donald Trump, who is willing to be the bull in the china shop, to be the kind of bully, to fight for our rights again, so that he is almost a byproduct of a much deeper cultural narrative.
Yeah.
Is that, would you, how would, is that
I
accurate at all,
totally
or
agree. What we have today is not because of Trump, right? Like the
right?
underlying conditions were there. He just tapped into something that was already growing. And it actually ties back to the conversation we started with,
Hmm.
ironically, like, uh, as a, and it's not just the United States. All of
Hmm.
our, what I would consider westernized allies, they're not all in the West, but westernized allies are dealing with the fact that their citizenry is saying these institutions that we set up, they're not working for us. This is, I'm not getting a good end of the deals. If you look
Hmm.
at what happened in 2008 with the financial crisis and so many of
Yeah.
the basically Wall Street getting bailed out, and the
Hmm.
Americans having to deal with the financial fallout, very significant financial fallout on everybody. There's an aspect of just anger at our institutions either being incompetent or failing, and that's one of the I think one of the challenges of our present moment is not necessarily people in government serving maliciously or with ill intent, but when institutions weaken, they're not. This is yeah, the thesis behind. Oh, I'm blanking. Is it Yuval Levin? I'm looking for the book. Anyway, the thesis that institutions used to form people, and now institutions are getting weaker and people are using them as platforms instead.
Hmm.
But what that means is that in being platformed by an institution, if you look at Congress, now you can get elected. And if you're just really good at social media and can get on Fox News, you can be a first time congressperson and have a lot of power. And just 20 years ago, nobody would have known your name. Nobody would have given you the time of day. You have to serve for several terms before you can get a seat on the committee that's going to do X, Y, and Z. So it used to be pay your dues, learn the institution, then you can have positions of leadership that might give you the prominence to have a public facing name to the
Hmm.
whoever you're serving, or the American people. Now it's like, no, you just have to be good at social media, and then you can
Right.
have power, and then you can do what you want in the institution, but you don't know how that institution works. You haven't been formed by that institution. You are now deforming the institution by using it as your platform. So there's this weird thing that's happening with our institutions that creates both weakness and mistrust in the institution itself. That then you also have people that are not being formed by the institution, so they don't actually have the competence to do the jobs that they're being asked to do. And it's not just in elected office. I do think this is throughout government, throughout maybe beyond government. And when we have people performing incompetently, then why would you trust that institution, right? So there's this kind of vicious cycle of the more we don't trust the institutions, the more the institutions don't have the power to actually help us become more competent in carrying out its functions, which leads to people administering things incompetently, which leads to less trust. I mean, and it's a cycle that we've been in for several decades. Now, I would argue that some of this comes from institutions making mistakes and not being transparent and owning up those mistakes. And so we might be in this period of just kind of resetting. And I don't know what I buy into the theory that we're in a liminal age in a gray zone that Mark Zayers talks about, that we don't know what the to be is. And that gives me some hope that maybe like we're moving to something new. And in so doing, our institutions are just crumbling. They're because they're not serving us well. And in that space, when our institutions aren't serving us well, we end up with a lot of anger, a lot of righteous anger. Like some of these are legitimate grievances, and a person like Donald Trump can come along and take advantage of that. And I think one of my great disappointments is that what we needed leaders to come alongside and rightly call out the failures of these institutions, but then also champion a vision of like, but we don't have to stay stuck in our grievances. We can repair this, or we can rebuild. And I think good leaders can both acknowledge the legitimate grievances and failures, but then they are offering solutions, and the solutions are not necessarily slanderous, burn it all down, but actual recognizing the complexity of the problems and putting together a plan for how you're going to deal with that. And I don't think any politicians right now have offered that. But Trump in particular has spent a lot of time sowing those grievances. He's aided and abetted by social media algorithms, which are designed to make the most money possible. And it turns out anger makes a lot of money. Anger gets you to vote. Anger raises your funds needed for your campaign. So we have both politicians and social media who have a monetary incentive to just keep us angry all the time. So there's a number of things that are kind of set up against us. And I think Trump just happened to be right place, right time, right personality for a country that was righteously angry. But we've gotten stuck. We've gotten stuck in the anger as opposed to moving towards solutions.
And he's an intelligent entertainer. I know he's a buffoon. He's narcissistic. He's all these things, like believes his own lies. But in terms of like the ability to walk in and like tap into something and see something and bend the conversation and poke people where they need to be poked to gain allegiance. I mean, there's a reason why he's so popular among, a decent percentage of the population. It's fascinating. Our political scene. You mentioned social media a few times now and how it feeds off of anger and is fueled by anger. And even the algorithms are wired that way. Where's this going to end up? Like I feel like studies have shown it. Experts talk about it. I think we kind of all know that now, that when we click on something that makes us angry, the algorithms are going to show us 10 more videos that are going to make us angry. And we keep clicking. And then it's midnight and you're just screaming out loud at how horrible the other side is. Like, where is it going to keep going? Where's this going to lead in 2 to 5 years? A completely divided country that's just hyper angry and depressed and on all kinds of medication to get them to fall asleep at night.
I mean, what's worse is that AI is
Yeah.
not going to
Oh,
help us with this. Like, it's actually going to make it worse. The virtual reality component to this, which I don't know that my generation and I'm a Zennial, Gen X, and Millennials. I don't know if it's going to capture us as much as it will capture Gen Z. Like, there will be a whole generation, not the entirety, but some percentage that will really get sucked into this idea that I'm just going to live virtually. And I like how that rewires our brains. We already know that cell phones are rewiring kids' brains, right? Like
right.
they have done brain scans and they're seeing differences in the way that our brains are being wired, particularly if you're going through adolescence and you're active on social media. I can't imagine what this looks like 10, 15 years from now when
Right.
virtual reality is more of a common thing that we use, maybe for practical work purposes, but also for some people just how they're going to live their life. They're not actually going to engage with real human beings. It's all going to be through this virtual environment. Like, how deformed will our soul
Yeah.
become through that? And one of the things that I talk about in the book, and I was clear, I don't have the data to prove this out yet, but I have a suspicion that some of the research that does show correlations and in some cases a causal link between social media use and increased anxiety and suicide among
Yeah.
younger populations. So Gen Z
Yeah.
predominantly is the group that came of age when social media was a thing. I suspect that the timing lines up nearly perfectly. I suspect what we're going to find is that part of the drivers of violence, and like I said, what's the underlying psychosocial drivers? It's a need for belonging, a need for
Right.
significance. If our phones are affecting the way kids are forming their identity in adolescence, if their identity is being formed through social media instead of peer-to-peer or peer-to-adult personal relationships, that leaves you lacking in actually developing the ability to figure out how I have significance. It certainly leaves you lacking in belonging. And so we see a whole host of negative outcomes, everything from drug abuse, gang violence, to, I think, probably the increase in mass attacks and targeted violence. And especially since our numbers are showing that the perpetrators of those attacks are skewing younger than they used to. We haven't shown this to be true yet. The data is not there, but I suspect that it won't take too many more years before we can start to show those things. Put another way, we are just beginning to understand how detrimental cell phone social media use in an adolescent is, and it has a number of negative outcomes. We know suicide, anxiety, and despair are part of those outcomes.
Yeah.
I suspect the increase in violence might also be tied to that.
I mean, Jonathan Haidt's recent book, The Anxious Generation, it sounds like you're almost quoting from it. If you're a parent, an aspiring parent, especially if your kids have not yet entered the cell phone age yet, you have to read that
Yeah.
book. You have to. It is. I wish I read it as a parent. Well, I wish it was written, long ago. It's I mean, everything you're saying, with lots and lots of data. It's no longer correlation. Like, oh,
Right.
we have cell phones and we also have um, anxiety and depression and suicidality. It has been shown now to be to play a causative role. Here's where I get depressed a little bit. I mean, I'm hopeful because of Jesus. I always got to come back to that. On a societal level, though, I mean, it seems like something has to change. Either um, the algorithms and all the machine behind all that has to change so that they're not feeding off of and feeling people's anger, but the monetary incentive seems to be so strong that this is producing lots of money. So what
Mhm.
company is going to step up and say, well, even though we can make a lot more money by rigging the system this way, we're not going to do it because it's bad for people. I'm sorry, sinfulness of humanity. I just don't see that happening. Or people are going to have to make a concerted, strong effort to detach from being online, to put your cell phone down, to take media fasts, and so on and so forth, especially younger people. And again, I've seen some efforts at that.
Yeah,
I know several churches that have done like a whole month-long digital fast as a church, as a mega church.
that's
And some
awesome.
people, oh yeah, yeah. And people are like, I feel so human. I feel so free. I could smell the air, like, um, some go back, some don't. And the ones that don't go back are living a more flourishing life. And we all know this. This is the thing. But still, people that even do those kind of momentary like detox, it's just like a rubber band effect. It's just like we come back to it. Our world is
Yeah.
so wired that way. So where's this going to lead?
Yeah.
Like, do you have any? I mean, in 10 years, are we just going to be a crippling pile of human anxiety, or what?
So I have two thoughts. One, what a great opportunity for the church to be salt and light,
Yes. Yeah.
because we believe that you are more than what you do, that your soul is made in the image of God, and that you are worthy of dignity and respect. And what that means is that I want to get to know you, not
Hmm.
through a virtual environment, but just like spend time with you, be with you. Um, and we get to model that for our kids. I mean, not saying this isn't hard. My husband and I really, um, I will, it's probably me. I really struggle with this. I am a type A personality and I want to get it all done.
Mm.
Practicing Sabbath is really hard for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I will tell you, nothing has driven me to say, I got to take this seriously than the fact that I have a 13-year-old and a 10-year-old, and I only have 5 to 8 years left with them. And then they've got to figure this out on their own. And oh my gosh, I've got to be modeling for
So
them
good.
the
Yeah.
the vision of what Sabbath gives us, and that rest, and that we don't always have to be on, and that like this cell phone thing, this tech, this computer, like it's actually enslaved us, and it is
Yeah.
not what God intended for us. To they should be tools. I really appreciate Andy Crouch's work,
Yeah.
Mike Cosper's work. Like, just, they are tools, but they should not own us, and they have enslaved us. And if we don't model that for our kids, like, I'm not looking for perfection, but fight, right? Fight for it so that your kids can see that you fight for that, because it's important for them to see us both struggling, and but not giving up in that struggle, not succumbing to the enslavement that that tech can be. Um, I think also the church, you know, helping explain to the world why we have that Sabbath, why we cultivate and focus on in real life local relationships through the body of through the church, as well as through our service to our neighbors. Um, that is so countercultural and unique right now. Everything is focused nationally. Everything
Right.
is all about if you're not doing it big, that you have 1 million followers on Instagram,
Mhm.
then like it's not worth it. And that is just the opposite of what Jesus teaches us. What it looks like to follow his ways is not to have 1 million followers on Instagram so we can make an impact. So modeling, the way of Jesus in our communities should be an opportunity for freedom for so many people to say, like, you have a sense of peace that I don't have. What is that? And
Yeah.
it gives us this opportunity to share the gospel. Well, I'm practicing a way that's pretty ancient, and I know it's countercultural, but in practicing that way, man, I do feel tremendous peace, and I feel like
Mhm.
I'm able to have much deeper relationships, and I find my significance in practicing this way, and I find my belonging in practicing this way. And I think so. On one hand, I share your concerns. I don't see a lot of um, positivity in the future in the direction that we as a culture are going. But I do see in that darkness great opportunity for the church to stand out and offer hope. and offer a different alternative to other things that are otherwise crushing our souls. Maybe the other piece of quasi hope, prayer probably, it's like, Lord, please. There are historically points where things just got really dark, whether it's polarization, just anger, and then some, like there's not a historical event or a leader that stepped in and took everybody in a different direction. It just changed. And the people that go and study these things, they're like, we don't know why, like confluence of events, but it's kind of like the pendulum swing, right? Like there's a point at which we all kind of go like, oh gosh, this is killing us. And maybe it is through the work of Jonathan Haidt, and as parents, us going like, oh my gosh, I don't want to give my kids a tool that's going to increase their likelihood for depression, suicide, anxiety by 66%. Like no parent in their right mind would want that for their child. And so maybe it is just being a little bit educated and banding together with other people in your community to say, like, let's do better for our kids. Like the parents from 10 years ago, they didn't have this information. They didn't know any better, but we do. We can do it differently. So maybe there are some moments like that where we can be empowered to effectuate that change. If that doesn't happen, then I'm praying for that, like the switch to just flip and we all kind of get back to having a rational mind. I don't know. Like that's where the prayer comes in, Lord. It looks dark. It looks dark and we need help.
That's so good. I mean, we did have a civil war, centuries of slavery, an East-West church split 1,000 years ago, the fall of Rome. I mean, there has been cataclysmic, the Black Plague, or like there's been humans have gone through some crazy stuff. So this isn't the first time. This is a new thing, very new actually, but it's not the only major challenge that's faced humanity. And I just want to reaffirm, I mean, the church has a wide open door to embody a more sustainable, flourishing way. I just think there needs to be, I think we need to elevate to the top of our list among Christian leaders the need for corporate communal discipleship in this area. If we just leave it up to individuals to do it, that's not going to have near the effect than something as simple as churches doing a digital fast, talking about how this is very urgent and necessary. Youth groups. I just talked to a youth pastor friend of mine who he banned all cell phones from all youth gatherings. There's no, and awesome. Kids hated it and now they love it. They're finally free for a couple hours from their enslavement, and just little things like that. Just like talking about it, exposing people to the major dangers that living primarily online will have for your humanity. God created us embodied creatures to live in an embodied local world, and we need to get back to that. Elizabeth, I've taken you over time, but man, I feel like we're just getting warmed up. Thank you so much for sharing. Again, the book is Kingdom of Rage, The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. Check it out wherever books are sold. Thanks so much for being a guest on Theology Now. I really appreciate the convo.
Thanks, Preston. And I really appreciate your ministry. Keep at it.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.